thank you all for coming out this Sunday morning. We're really excited. It's been about a year since all the protests across the country broke out. So we thought this would be a great time to kind of take a step back and do kind of like a broader overview meeting rather than some of the ones where we're much more in the weeds. So let's see. Okay, so we ready to kind of like an introductions and welcome, then we're just gonna go through this overview and then we're gonna do an exciting breakout room session later, which will be just kind of like an open house where, you know, after you've heard what we've had to say, you can kind of wander around and figure out how and if you want to get involved more with us or just learn more if you have questions. And then we'll come back for a brief wrap up. Cool. So just a little bit about who this group is. So I call it Group 1.0. That was sort of happening up until end of last May and beginning of last June. So we're an ACLU People Power group. So ACLU People Power, it's grassroots. There are groups kind of like all over the country. Because it's grassroots, you kind of decide what you want to work on. But we do stay guided by ACLU principles. For example, you know, everything we do is nonpartisan. And this particular group has been focused on police accountability in Seattle and King County since 2017. And so our approach to that has been, one, just trying to educate ourselves on the local police accountability landscape. And then in that process, learning what are the obstacles to the progress that we want to see, and then working to figure out how to target those with the power to remove those obstacles. So just quickly, back in 2017, we worked on advocating for city and county legislation to expand community oversight of the police. Then in 2018, we opposed the ratification of the problematic Seattle Police Officers Guild, or SPOG, contract. In 2019, there were city council elections. So we worked to elevate the issue of police accountability around those elections. You know, 7 of our 9 Seattle city council members were getting elected that year. So it was a great time to try to get people on that council who would be more like-minded. And then, yeah, we help provide community input on upcoming police union contract negotiations. You know, that 2018 contract was definitely not what we wanted to see, and there were opportunities ahead of the next negotiations to provide public comment at public hearings. So then in early 2020, we were continuing to monitor the progression of the Seattle consent decree. We were trying to advocate for appointment of an external advisor with accountability expertise to be part of those contract negotiations. And then King County was trying to implement some reforms to their inquest process, which the city of Seattle filed a lawsuit against. So we were trying to figure out how to oppose that. But then, so on May 25th, the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis occurred, and you know that spawned giant protests breaking out everywhere, including here in Seattle. I just want to call attention to the middle slide. That was a display put up by the Public Defender Association last year. Just these are all names of local people who have lost their lives from police violence. So it was just important for us to center that the protests here were not just about what happened in Minneapolis, but what was happening here in our own backyard, and that, you know, we need to see change happen everywhere. So just some selected highlights that kind of relate to what we had been working on right after. So on June 1st, the Office of Police Accountability said that they had already received 12,000 complaints about the Seattle Police Department after one weekend of Seattle protests. On June 3rd, the Seattle City Attorney withdrew this motion. They had been trying to terminate the sustainment plan under the consent decree. We had been really worried about that because all the community groups were really preoccupied with dealing with the COVID pandemic. And we felt like this was kind of a move by the city to sort of, you know, get out from under monitoring while people weren't really paying attention. On June 5th, the Seattle accountability bodies, so the CPC, OPA, OIG, that's the Community Police Commission, the Office of Police Accountability, and the Office of the Inspector General, they sent a joint memo that the Seattle police should stop using tear gas. On June 9th, the Seattle City Attorney withdrew that petition we were worried about that was challenging the King County inquest process. And then on June 17th, the MLK Labor Council expelled SPOG from their council. So a lot of the goals or the things we have been working on leading up to that kind of all happened really quickly, like in the span of 2 weeks. So that was really great. But then, you know, we were kind of left trying to figure out, well, what are we working on now? So we took a moment to become Group 2.0 and sort of reorient ourselves. And following ACLU principles, they had come up with a 3-point divestment plan, or 3-point plan for how to address all the issues with police. So they summarized it in this tweet thread on June 2nd. And so the 3 parts are pulled over here on the right. So kind of the pillars of that are, 1, just trying to reduce police interaction at all. So let's not have them enforcing non-serious offenses. Another pillar would be trying to implement enforceable legal constraints to limit the police use of force. And then the 3rd pillar is trying to reinvest savings from police budgets into community-centered alternatives. So we decided to take those 3 pillars and came up with a new vision and mission for what this group is working towards. So, our vision is for public safety in Washington to be community driven and to meet the needs of all people equitably. And so then our mission is kind of following on those 3 pillars, kind of working on all 3 of those. So in terms of our focus areas, we had started out working kind of primarily in Seattle and then found ourselves expanding into King County. And, kind of as you start down the path of trying to understand how to affect change, you start to realize how interconnected the different levels of government are. And so what we ran into in Seattle was that some of the issues we were running up against, we kept being told that, well, that's a state issue. So, we here at the city don't have the power to override the problematic police union contract. What you need to do is go to the state and lobby them to change state laws so that we can affect changes there. So because of that, we said, okay, fine. I guess we're also going to work on the state level. So these are kind of our 3 focus areas that the group works on. And so kind of the structure of the group, we have kind of like a broad steering committee to kind of just help with overall administration of the group, like setting up and running these meetings. And then we have 3 working committees that just really focus on those 3 geographic areas. So there's the Seattle committee, the King County committee, and the state legislature committee. And so what we're going to do now is, like, for each of those 3 areas, just kind of run through an overview of the year in review, kind of like events that happened, and then sort of how our group was plugging in, just so you can get a sense of what happened and what we did, and then we'll have a better sense after that of where we go next. So for Seattle committee, I'm going to hand it over to Amy, who is amazing and writes an awesome newsletter that you should all subscribe to, and she's going to walk us through what happened in Seattle.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. I'm Amy. It's lovely to see you, and thank you for giving your time to learn more about these important issues. So I'm going to talk about Seattle, the Seattle committee, what we do, and then the timeline of what's happened in Seattle during the past year. So first of all, the Seattle committee, what we do, I was putting together this list a few days ago. I was like, oh, we do quite a lot. You get lost in the weeds and you don't realize everything you're doing until you pause for a moment. So one of the main things we do is track what's happening, which is a huge job. And so we attend a lot of Seattle City Council meetings. I attend a lot personally and live tweet them so that community members can know what's happening and what specifically is being said by whom, even if they don't have time to attend the meetings themselves. We attend CPC meetings, we attend press conferences, we follow different news media, especially a lot of local independent journalists and news organizations. And then we figure out action alerts that are relevant and that can actually potentially make a big impact on what's happening here in Seattle and send them out to the group. We attend meetings, teach-ins, panels, campaign events, candidate forums, you name it, we try to go. We meet with local officials, so that's like our council members, for example, and we meet with other community groups, like Indivisible, for example. We work towards educating ourselves and others, which I think is really important because I find that it's a continuing process for me and that I'm constantly learning new things and my perspective shifts as I get more information. So we share resources, we host watch parties, we discuss relevant issues. At some point, I'd love to start some kind of book club or podcast club or something. We'll see. And then we also monitor the SPOG contract negotiations, and advocate for police union contract reform, some of which happens at the state level. So in a nutshell, that is what we do. So the Seattle Year in Review. I was putting together this timeline, and a lot has happened in the past year. And I actually think that's, I mean, obviously some of it has been bad, but I do feel like it's hopeful that everyone has been paying more attention, I feel, to what's been happening, and we have had forward movement, which is a big deal, especially for something so entrenched. So in the summer of 2020, as Shannon was saying, pretty much for the whole summer, there were protests here in Seattle and around the region against police brutality. And here in Seattle, the SPD repeatedly used excessive force, blast balls, the tear gas, the kettling techniques, et cetera, et cetera. And also, we saw them targeting journalists, medics, and legal observers, and there were some really harrowing stories of that. There's things like the pink umbrella incident, which was one of the particularly egregious protests where things went wrong. Then the SPD abandoned the East Precinct, and Chaz Chop formed and lasted for not quite a month. At this time, Decriminalize Seattle and King County Equity Now formed a coalition and asked for three things: that the SPD be defunded by 50%, that those funds be reallocated to community-led health and safety systems, and that protesters arrested during the uprising be released without charges. So those were really the three demands that we as a group were trying to uplift and advocate for ourselves as well. In July, we saw SPD via the city attorney Pete Holmes serving a subpoena to several local news outlets to get unpublished footage from protests, which was, very, very egregious. It's a very egregious kind of attack on the rights of the free press, for example. The council had passed legislation banning less than lethal crowd control weapons, but a judge passed a temporary restraining order stopping that legislation from going into effect. And 7 out of the 9 city council members came out in support of defunding SPD by 50% and reinvesting the money in community needs. And that was a big deal because that was a veto-proof majority for that idea at that time. So at that time, our committee was supporting the community demands of King County Equity Now and Decriminalize Seattle by meeting with council members, attending meetings, emailing our council members, calling them, giving public comment at meetings, and trying to pin Mayor Durkin down at her radio. She's on a radio show, The Record. So we moved on to August when we saw Chief Carmen Best resign. The city council passed a summer rebalancing budget because of COVID. Basically, they had to redo the budget early because it was hit so badly. And they did do some small cuts to the SPD budget at that time. And then the mayor vetoed that budget with its cuts. So one of our very big pushes at that moment was to try to get the council to overturn those vetoes. It honestly looked like they weren't going to, and then at the last minute things shifted. It was very exciting and emotional, I think, for all of us. And all 3 of those vetoes were in fact overturned, and the budget was passed. And then they began working on this year's budget. So no rest for the weary. So at that time, we were mostly advocating for that veto overturn. We were still going to talk on the radio show. We were educating ourselves, writing letters to the editor, et cetera, et cetera. So November, budget season here in Seattle, the heart of budget season. And this is the budget that we finally got. The budget cut SPD by their budget by 20%. However, it was only about 8.2%, not including unit transfers. And that matters because that was the amount of money that was available to be reallocated to community-led organizations. The rest of it is still being used. It's just not within SPD. It's in other city departments. There are also some significant investments made, $30 million to the Mayor's Task Force Equitable Communities Initiative, $30 million to participatory budgeting, $30 million to the Strategic Investment Fund, which has to do with affordable housing and things of that nature. $10 million to community-led public safety investments, and about $1 million to the Office of Civil Rights for some of their work around the harm that the legal system does to people, basically. And so that's what happened in November, which we were, advocating for and continuing to write, to call, to comment, to try to make sure that these investments were made and that these cuts were made. You can also see our little power map on this slide to the left, which is a very cool graphic, just thinking about who has power in the city and where we can apply levers to help make change. So in December, the Black Brilliance Research Project began their research project to inform the participatory budgeting process. And in the meantime, in Seattle versus Black Lives Matter, Seattle King County and the ACLU, the judge held the city of Seattle in contempt for violating his crowd control injunction. So that was a big victory for Black Lives Matter and the ACLU. And then there was the SPD came and said that they had overspent their budget by about $5 million and asked for it to be backfilled, basically. And the city council eventually decided to give them that money, but that they were going to cut that same amount of money from the SPD's 2021 budget, which we'll talk more about in a second. And also of note, the current SPOG contract, the police union contract with SPD, expired at the end of the year. So we were doing some work at the beginning of the month, and then we were resting. Self-care is important in activism, exclamation point. Always a good thing to remember and reiterate, because I think it's really important to be sustainable and to stave off burnout, because this is not a short-term problem and it's not going to have a short-term solutions. So pacing, I think, is very important for all of us. We also were preparing to advocate for collective bargaining reform with the state legislature, who's about to go into session. And we were excited because for the first time, the CPC was going to be allowed to have access to the bargaining table for negotiating the police contract, which is new and a positive sign. So 2020 SPD, the OPA recently released their annual report of 2020. 602 distinct SPD employees received complaints in 2020. 40% of all sworn officers in SPD received at least one complaint. The use of force complaints rose dramatically from previous years, the number of them, and 18% of OPA investigations resulted in sustained findings. I think it is important to note that even with a sustained finding, oftentimes that's just a oral or written warning to an officer. Occasionally, like 1 day of leave. A lot of the sustained findings don't result in very large measures. Meanwhile, 186 sworn officers left the SPD in 2020, which was twice the estimated attrition rate. So they only thought 90 some officers would leave that year, and 186 did, and that is a trend that we're seeing continue on this year. And the SPOG contract negotiations are, nothing is moving with that yet. So we're still waiting. And then we move on to 2021. So first thing in January, at least 6 SPD officers were in attendance of the Stop the Steal rally, aka insurrection, in Washington, D.C. The OVA has been investigating those officers and their presence there, and we expect results really soon of that investigation. Early July is what the director has said. So we'll be watching that. And the city council passed legislation granting the OPA and OIG subpoena power. The OPA and OIG are 2 police oversight bodies in Seattle. However, they can't do this yet because it has to be bargained as part of the SPOG contract. But I do think it was a move to kind of get more leverage during that contract to get a better contract. And in February, the Black Brilliance Research Project delivered their final report and recommendations for participatory budgeting, which was very exciting. Also, in that time, we went to the Community Police Commission, which is the 3rd oversight body in Seattle. Seattle has 3 police oversight bodies. We went to their community conversation about Seattle police contracts and learned a lot about more of the nitty gritty of the process. Always happy to answer more questions about that whenever folks are interested at a later time, because it is complicated. And we also asked some pointed questions of our own and supported community demands about what we want to see in that contract. And the state legislative session also began in January. In March, SPD had changes to their use of force and crowd control policies be approved. These were changes that SPD initiated themselves, so they weren't changes that came from city council or from any of the oversight bodies. It's kind of a standard practice for them to occasionally update those. In April, SPD declared that they were in the middle of a staffing crisis, and they did not want the $5 million they had overspent last year to be cut from their budget this year, after all, which became quite a brouhaha. So there was legislation that kept being changed and substituted and amended having to do with this that took many months to resolve, as we'll see a little later. And then in May, the story of the text message scandal broke. And what that was that Mayor Durkin had text messages missing from many months. If you're a public official, you're required to disclose things like your text messages from your work phone, basically, to save and archive those so that they can be requested from public records requests, most often done by journalists, although, members of the public can do that as well. So the fact that those text messages were missing was actually illegal. It's a felony. There were other text messages missing as well from the former police chief Best, from the fire chief Scoggins, and from several other members of SPD's senior command staff, all missing. And some of the text messages missing was from June 2020, at the height of the protests, and when the East Precinct was abandoned. So a lot of the questions surrounding what actually was going on then, the answers could very well have been in those mysteriously missing text messages. The mayor's counsel, her lawyer, tried to hide the fact that these text messages were missing in various kind of shady ways, which was pretty shocking. However, it did obviously come out eventually. And now, happily, the Seattle Times is suing the city. So we'll be following that lawsuit with great interest. During this whole time, mostly our group was focused on state issues, just because the state legislative session was such a big one this year, and we'll talk about that a little later. Later in May, the interim chief of police, Chief Diaz, overturned the OPA's finding in the pink umbrella case. So the OPA had sustained findings. They had said, no, stuff that happened with the pink umbrella case was not okay. And the chief said, and they were gonna penalize a specific officer, I think Officer Brooke, and the chief overturned that decision. And there was a lot of confusion as to what was going on there. And eventually he demoted an assistant chief of police instead of disciplining the original person, because he said it had more to do with a greater tactical plan and leadership of the police department. And the 911 dispatch center, which has lived in SPD until this point, was just very recently moved to the new Community Safety and Communications Center. So that no longer lives within SPD. It is now independent, which is a big deal. And in June, I call it the tortured SPD bill because it went on for so many months. The bill about the $5 million of overspend in 2020 that we wanted to cut from 2021 had been changed beyond recognition, so that it was actually giving a lot of money back to SPD, and it got very complicated. Anyways, it failed to pass, and it was an interesting failure because you had people voting against it, council members voting against it, who both were like, we don't want to cut any money from the police, and so we can't support this. And people who were like, this is not holding the SPD accountable fiscally. Like, we said we were going to cut 5 million and we need to do that, and that's not what this bill does anymore. They wouldn't vote for it either, which is why it ultimately failed to pass, which we felt was ultimately a win. And participatory budgeting had kind of gotten a little bit bogged down, but the bill lifting some of the proviso on some of the money unanimously passed, sending funds to the Office of Civil Rights, not the Department of Neighborhoods, which we were very happy about, to procure a third-party administrator to administrate the process of participatory budgeting. So basically, they're going to look for someone else to hire to oversee the whole process. And we hope to see participatory budgeting move forward next year, possibly with voting in the summer. We'll see. Summer 2022. That's the hope. So those were the things we were kind of advocating, and we were really following that SPD budget bill closely. We were following participatory budgeting closely and advocating as we could for those issues. What's next? All right, so one of our big focuses right now is the elections. The primary is at the beginning of August, and then the main election is in November, as always. In Seattle, we have the mayor up for election, 2 citywide city council positions, 8 and 9, and the city attorney. So one of the things we're doing is creating a policing and public safety voter guide. So we've created candidate questionnaires, which we have now sent out to all the candidates, and hopefully they will send them back to us. And then we will publish those results of the questionnaires on our website. And right now we are working on writing up issue explainers to explain some of the main issues at play in terms of how it interacts with policing, with the courts, et cetera, et cetera. And we're also tracking candidate forums, figuring out when they are, brainstorming what questions to ask, both in terms of getting candidates on the record as to their position, and to educate the public about what's happening and you know what issues are important to us and why. So that's going to be one of our big focuses for the next few months going forward, and even into budget season, which will probably be our other big focus this year, I would say.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to cover King County and state. So just take a breather. Luckily, there's not quite as much that happened at those two levels as in Seattle. Seattle definitely was a doozy this year. So the King County Committee kind of has decided to work on three main goals. So these are to advocate for changes in policy and practices of King County and the Sheriff's Office to improve police accountability and racial equity toward public safety for all. Part of that is to be responsive to community concerns regarding the Sheriff's Office and helping to amplify their messages. And then something that we discovered when we started working on King County is that it feels like nobody really knows what the King County government does, including ourselves. We actually found that when we reached out to meet with county council members, they were really excited because apparently nobody ever does that. So anyway, King County is a really fun place to be involved because there's just not as much attention being paid to it, but there's a lot to do. And so most of our focus has been about the part of King County that's policed by the Sheriff's Office, but there are also many other cities within King County that have their own police departments that have also had many problematic things happen in them. For example, Auburn and Kent come to mind. So, we are interested in branching out and engaging with other cities that aren't under King County Sheriff's Office, but, it's also all about capacity and who's in the group and who's interested on working what. So the King County year in review. So in July of 2020, the King County Council hosted a town hall on some upcoming charter amendments, and then subsequently voted or did whatever they needed to do to make them appear on the November 2020 ballot. Of those charter amendments, 4 were related to policing. So Charter Amendment 1 related to the inquest reforms. Charter Amendment 4 was about giving the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight subpoena authority. The Office of Law Enforcement Oversight, or OLEO, is the county oversight body for policing. Then Charter Amendment 5 was making the King County Sheriff an appointed position rather than elected. And Charter Amendment 6 was about giving the county government the ability to actually change the structure and duties of the Department of Public Safety. It had been written into the charter at some point that they did not have that ability. And so in terms of trying to figure out how to overhaul policing at the county level, that was a huge barrier. So what our group was working on then was just trying to understand what was King County. So here's like a map of the county council districts. It covers a lot of area. And then just learning more about the King County Sheriff's Office. So in September of 2020, the Charter for Justice campaign launched to get those charter amendments passed. And in addition, the My Chance Dunlap Giddens Youth Rights Ordinance passed, which was requiring that youth be given the right to counsel when engaging with the criminal legal system. So in October, it was full-on election season time. And so the King County Police Officers Guild and other police unions and associations spent over $217,000 trying to oppose Charter Amendments 5 and 6, which was the sheriff appointment and the structure and duties charter amendments. By comparison, the small Charter for Justice campaign, I forget, it was maybe like $6,000 to $8,000 is all that they had. And then the election happened in November, and we were, much like the veto override in Seattle, not sure that this was going to happen, but the King County Charter amendments actually all passed with healthy majorities, and I admit that I cried. So it was really exciting. So during this time, to support all that, we met with county council members, and as I said, they were thrilled that people wanted to interact with them and get engaged, and that actually, I think, led to Councilmember Rod Dembowski starting the actual Charter for Justice campaign. As part of that, we co-hosted a town hall on the King County Charter Amendments with the League of Women Voters, Seattle, King County. And then we put a voter guide together last year that explained what the charter amendments related to policing were about and why you should vote for them and all that. And then one of our members actually offered to speak about the charter amendments at a community meeting on Vashon, and then it turned out the person who showed up to present the opposing side was actually the King County Sheriff. So it's pretty exciting. Then there was sort of a dead period after the charter amendments passed while they were trying to figure out how to work on the implementation. In February of this year, we caught wind of a proposed roadmap for implementing it at a Law and Justice County Council meeting. In March, the ordinance that was proposed was established. And so they set up an advisory committee to come up with recommendations for how to go about appointing a sheriff or what values that should be looked for. At the same time, the current sheriff, a lot of news was breaking that was not so great. The group Not This Time ended up calling for Sheriff Joe Henknick's resignation, initially because of inconsistent discipline for different King County deputies in terms of social media posting. Also in March, the county settled with the family of Tommy Lay for $5 million. So yeah, during this time, the group was, continuing to meet with county council members to discuss next steps on the charter amendments. We took a moment to actually analyze the election data on charter amendments and found that, in almost all jurisdictions, whether you look at legislative district, city, county council district, I mean, they were widely supported. And so I think sometimes there's this narrative in King County that Seattle is kind of like making the decisions for the whole rest of the county. And in terms of these charter amendments, that was not true. And so that's helpful in terms of taking that to advocate at those other levels of government, whether that is like a local city like Burien or your county council district, or even your legislative district at the state level. We also met with council members, Ahalai staff, as well as the Kenmore city manager to kind of discuss their thoughts about this proposed roadmap for implementation, and as well as advisory committee. And then 2 of our group members applied for and got selected to serve on that advisory committee. So in April, the advisory committee started to meet. And so I think they have just been kind of getting started, gradually kind of establishing norms and getting that process going. So then the city of Kent settled with the family of Giovanni Joseph McDade for $4.4 million. The county settled with Rodney Wheeler for $500,000. This individual had been framed by the King County Sheriff's Office for a murder he didn't commit and spent 2 years in jail as part of that. And as a result of all these things happening, there were continued calls for the sheriff's resignation. In May, there were even more calls for the sheriff resignation. I think at this point, King County Executive Dow Constantine, his challenger for that position, Joe Wynn, Councilmember Zahalai, as well as some other elected officials also joined the call. And then notably, the King County Police Officers Guild even came out and said that the sheriff should resign. However, the sheriff has not resigned, so we're still stuck with her for now. And then in June, the King County Council passed a facial recognition ban for the King County Sheriff's Office, as well as other county departments and agencies. So the group at this time was just working on supporting our group members that are on that advisory committee. We're just working to monitor the implementation of the charter amendments. And then we've joined in the community calls for the sheriff's resignation by sending a letter to the sheriff and county council members and signing open letters with other community organizations. So in terms of what's next for King County, I think we're particularly focused on how the implementation of Charter Amendments 5 and 6 happen. So we're following that progress of that advisory committee. And then as they begin having community engagement opportunities, we'll be looking to figure out how to amplify and try to let people know that that's happening and they can go and make their voice heard about what they would like to see. So for what's next on King County, much like Seattle, we have county and municipal elections this year. So notably in King County, the executive position is up for election, as well as the odd numbered county council positions. A lot of these odd numbered ones happen to be the more conservative county council members. So we're excited to see if there can be a shift in some of those positions. And then, yeah, there's also other city races in cities across King County for things like their city councils, mayors, school boards, things like that. So similarly, we're going to be putting together a voter guide. So we're definitely going to cover the executive and county council. And then depending on, how much interest or capacity or new volunteers we get, we can expand and include more races across the county. So similarly, we're doing candidate questionnaires and issue explainers, as Amy described, for Seattle, as well as following along with candidate forums. Okay, so moving on to the state. So the state legislature committee, what we do. So, I mean, I think for me, I talked about this in my breakout room, but a lot of what I learned this year more is about how the different levels of government interact with one another. And part of the motivating reason we got more involved at the state level is that when we were trying to advocate for things at the city and county level, we ran into times where we were told, well, we don't actually have power to influence that. You need to go to the state to get this specific thing done. So we're like, okay, so we're going to the state. So what we do at the state level is we work to get candidates and electeds on the record. We use that to create tools and resources to help inform both voters and constituents. We have been identifying, monitoring, and advocating for good bills and also opposing bad bills. We've been tracking the implementation of bills that pass, and we try to work in coalition with like-minded groups. So the year in review at the state level, in June of 2020, the state's House Democrats Policing Policy Leadership Team started meeting to kind of put together a broad suite of legislation that they would be trying to pass in the 2021 session. In July, the governor started a task force on independent investigations of police use of force. And then in November, the entire state house and half of the state senate was up for election in the general election. So what we did last year was we did a voter guide, but it was for state legislature candidates. And then the issues that we presented in there were the ones likely to be introduced in the 2021 legislative session. So December 2020, we learned that the state legislature would be remote as the COVID-19 pandemic continued. That was actually pretty exciting because it gave a lot more opportunities for the public to be able to be engaged. It used to be if you wanted to sign in pro at a hearing or give public testimony, you actually had to physically be in Olympia. But because of the remoteness of this year's session, we were able to do all of that from home. And I would say personally, having done both ways, it's absolutely wonderful to not have to wake up at 5 a.m. to drive down to Olympia for a committee hearing. Then in January, the 2021 legislative session began. So just here on the left, these were the priority bills that our group decided to work on. There were many, many other bills, but we had limited numbers of people. And so this is the ones we decided to focus our attention on. So there was a bill that was dealing with police tactics, things like banning no-knock warrants, chokeholds, that type of thing. There was another one that was establishing a statewide standard for de-escalation and use of force. Currently it was sort of that each local jurisdiction could have their own policy, and so it was just very confusing. There was also a bill that dealt with decertification of problematic police officers. We also worked on a bill that would have allowed for civil liability cases to proceed without qualified immunity being an obstacle. And so note, this is cases at the state level. There's both qualified immunity at the state and the federal level. So that's something I know I personally learned this year. We also advocated to end driving with license suspended in the third degree suspensions. This is where people who cannot afford to pay their tickets will get their license suspended. And then if they are caught driving that way, then they get into this horrible path with the criminal legal system that, affects everything. And so the ACLU has been working to push against this for many, many years. We have been supporting that for many years. And so we were hoping that this was the year that that would finally pass. Then we also worked on the Pathways to Recovery Act, which was about decriminalizing drug possession and instead supporting people with treatment and recovery services. And then finally, we worked on a bill that was addressing collective bargaining reform. So trying to remove serious police misconduct from discipline for serious police misconduct from the bargaining table. And so in February, we got to the first cutoffs in the legislative session where those last two bills I just mentioned both died. Also in February, the Washington State Supreme Court released the State v. Blake decision, which declared that the drug possession law in the state was unconstitutional. Then in March, the Civil Liability Qualified Immunity Bill died, and a Senate bill was introduced to try to address kind of the situation that the state was in with regards to that State v. Blake decision. So then we get to April, and there was the passage of many bills. So pretty much all the ones that I mentioned that didn't die previously passed: the police tactics, de-escalation, use of force, decertification. And then both DWLS3 and the Blake decision passed. I put stars next to them because the state that they ended up leaving the legislature in, we did not agree with. So that's another thing. It's like sometimes you start following a bill, but by the time it goes through all of its modifications and iterations, you may end up with a bill that you don't actually like, which so it's important to be following it and understand what's actually happening. Then in May, there was a big celebration when Governor Inslee signed a package of 12 police accountability laws, including many that we had advocated for at a ceremony down in Tacoma. And then on that DWLS3 issue, just this month, a judge, the courts ruled that the driver's license suspension for unpaid tickets was also, unconstitutional. So there's actually a halt on that. So perhaps we are getting to a solution to the problem through the judicial route rather than the legislative route. So during this whole time, our committee worked a whole bunch, producing action alerts for these different bills. We did sign-ins at the committee hearings. We testified at committee hearings. We met with legislators, and we also participated in lobby days. So what's next for state legislature? We're super excited that all of that legislation passed, but not passing is not just the main thing. You also have to look at how the legislation gets implemented. So we're going to try to follow progress of that along with other coalition groups. And then we're already thinking ahead to next legislative session. We took a break, as Amy mentioned before. Self-care is very important, and it was a grueling legislative session, so we took a breather. But we're going to start ramping up again to think ahead to kind of the main things that got left behind this year that we think are really important. So for collective bargaining reform, so we're working with the ACLU of Washington to kind of develop a plan for how we can engage better with labor ahead of the 2022 legislative session. And then, some of us are also volunteering to help out with police union contract collection and coding with Campaign Zero. In terms of the State v. Blake decision, I think the Treatment First Washington Coalition is likely to be running a ballot initiative in 2022. So stay tuned in terms of ways to plug in if that is what you're passionate about. So that's it. That's where we've been, what's happened, what we've done. And I think now we're going to do some time for Q&A.
Well, there's a question from Heather who's asking, what are the main groups we're collaborating with for advocacy, etc.?
So some of them are here with us. So I think we've been working a lot with League of Women Voters, Deb and Heather Kelly Without Any are there. We've also been connecting better this year with indivisible groups, which is great because they have a much wider network in terms of pushing out things to do in terms of actions. So actually there's a lot of different indivisible groups I feel like we've come in contact with, both Kirkland, Bellevue, maybe the state one. Anybody who's from Indivisible, and I haven't said your Indivisible group, let me know. Wallingford Indivisible. There's a lot of indivisible groups, and so they've been great to plug in with and share information with. Some of our group members attend meetings with impacted groups such as Not This Time and Next Steps Washington. And then, for the state work, the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability formed. So I think that we've also been looking to them for a lot in terms of where to head. I'm trying to think what else. Peter, so I don't exactly know what your group, or if it is an actual group, but kind of the folks working on kind of the Black Brilliance Research Project, it used to be under King County Equity now, like that's all shifting, but we're in touch with them. And Peter helps us out a lot at our meetings in terms of, understanding all the things in Seattle. I'm sure I'm leaving out stuff, but it's just, it's been great to be connecting with more groups because just there's a lot to know and do. And so other groups have strengths of ours are better at some things than we are. So, and anybody else, if I forgot anything, feel free to hop in.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I've been reading about Olympia's proposal to start 2 different cahoots type groups. And I'm wondering if that is something that our group might want to promote.
Some meeting I was in recently, somebody talked about that. Does anybody remember?
Yeah, Sally, I think knows.
Yeah, I think it might be Heather
Okay,
Kelly and
thank you.
the Heather Kelly without an extra E. There are two, there are two Heather Kellys. I'll just briefly share that our group, Indivisible East Side, and especially the racial equity group, is really heavily focused on this particular issue about cahoots models and crisis response. And I can send you some emails, or I'll put something in the chat, but we did visit Olympia last week. We had a field trip there, like in a car, went there actually, and spent 2 hours with the woman who started that non-police crisis response group. And Seattle has something sort of interesting with Health One through Seattle Fire Department. And so does East Side Fire and Rescue. So there's a lot of action along these lines in the area. And the 988 state ledge bill, the HB 1477. So this is there's a national law starting the 988 crisis response line, but Washington State's bill was passed. Heather Kelly, please jump in if I've got this wrong. Is one of the leading bills in the country. And next July, that phone line will go live, and you can call that number for crisis response. And so there's a lot of money that comes with that, and also the American Rescue Plan. So it really intersects with this policing work in the sense that it's taking things that should never have been in the police jurisdiction anyway. They don't even want to do it, honestly. Police don't really want that work either. So we have some really massively exciting things happening in Washington State. People are super excited about it. So that was I'm not known for being brief, but that was brief.
Thank you, Sally. Okay, then I see one that was, how do we get involved in the data collection and coding? So Lauren, so I have the contact info for the person at Campaign Zero and can set you up with that. So if you get in touch, I don't have it off right at hand, but I can get you connected there if desired.